Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. Story 1. The Disappearance of the Springfield 3, 1992, Missouri. They vanished without a trace. No screams, no struggle, no goodbye. 3 women, 1 house, and a mystery so disturbing it still haunts Missouri to this day. This is not just a missing persons case. It's a silence that screams in the dark. Welcome to the unsolved terror of the Springfield 3. Springfield, Missouri, in the early summer of 1992, was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. It was a community that valued familiarity and comfort, where graduation celebrations filled the air with optimism and dreams. That June, the city felt alive with anticipation as high school seniors said their goodbyes to one chapter of life and stepped eagerly into the next. Among them were Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall, 2 bright, carefree teenagers who had just walked across the stage at Kickapoo High School, full of hope and ready to enjoy their final summer before college. Susie Streeter was known for her outgoing personality, striking looks, and close bond with her mother, Cheryl Levitt. Susie's friend Stacy was described by classmates as gentle and kind-hearted, someone who rarely stirred conflict. The 2 girls had been planning for this night for weeks. After attending their graduation ceremony, they joined several friends at various parties, bouncing from one gathering to the next, doing what teenagers do when they're filled with excitement and a sense of freedom. They had initially intended to spend the night at a friend's house, but due to the crowded conditions there, the girls decided to change plans and sleep at Susie's place instead. Cheryl Levitt, Susie's 47-year-old mother, had been home that evening. A cosmetologist by trade, she was known for being hardworking, private, and a devoted parent. Her relationship with Susie was close, marked by mutual respect and the kind of connection that comes from navigating life together through challenges and change. When Susie and Stacy decided to come back to the Levitt home on 1717 East Del Mar Street, it was likely without a second thought. After all, it was supposed to be just another quiet night. There was no reason to suspect anything would go wrong. What happened after that moment remains one of the most baffling mysteries in American true crime history. Sometime in the early morning hours of June 7th, all 3 women, Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy, vanished without a trace. There were no calls for help, no alarms triggered, no frantic messages left behind. Just silence. The following day, Stacy's mother tried to reach her daughter to no avail. After receiving no response, she went to the Levitt residence to check in. She found the house unlocked. Inside, everything appeared strangely normal at first glance. All 3 women's purses were inside. Their cars were parked out front. Susie and Stacy's clothes from the graduation ceremony were neatly folded. Makeup sat unused. Cigarettes and personal items were untouched. Nothing seemed obviously out of place, until you noticed what wasn't there. 3 women were simply gone. There were subtle signs that hinted at something more sinister. The porch light was broken. The globe covering the bulb had been shattered. The glass had been swept up and thrown away, a detail that raised concerns about who had cleaned it and why. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no ransacked rooms. But it was the eerie quiet and the sense of stillness that unsettled everyone who entered. The TV was still on. A dog was inside. The house wasn't just undisturbed, it was frozen, as if time had stopped shortly after the women walked in. Friends and family who visited the home in those early hours before police were officially called in May have unknowingly altered the scene. In their panic and concern, they cleaned up, answered the phone, and moved items around, possibly compromising crucial forensic evidence. Among the disturbing details was a series of strange phone calls left on the answering machine, calls filled with sexual content and disturbing messages. One person reportedly deleted at least one message by accident, thinking it was a prank. That message was never recovered. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, but also no clue as to where the women had gone or who might have taken them. The sense of dread set in quickly. It became clear this wasn't a case of teenage girls sneaking off or a mother taking a sudden trip. All signs pointed to something far more serious. People who knew the women insisted they wouldn't just leave without telling anyone. They had responsibilities, routines, and plans. Cheryl had appointments scheduled. Susie had left behind her dog, whom she adored. Stacy had been excited about spending time with friends. None of it made sense. As word spread across Springfield, panic gave way to fear. Volunteers joined searches. Flyers were distributed. The story hit local media and quickly drew national attention. But even in those early days, there was a sinking feeling among many that the case wouldn't be solved easily. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no solid evidence. Just a peaceful house, now turned into a monument of confusion, and 3 lives that had seemingly been erased in the span of a few quiet hours. What began as a night of celebration for Susie and Stacy would become a lifetime of unanswered questions. The ordinary had turned sinister, and the house on East Delmar Street, once filled with laughter and life, now stood as the last known location of 3 women swallowed by an unexplainable silence. The house at 1717 East Delmar Street appeared untouched from the outside. A modest 1-story home in a quiet neighborhood, it gave no indication that anything sinister had occurred within. There were no warning signs, no shattered windows, no cries heard by neighbors. Yet inside that house, something had happened, something deeply wrong that left behind an invisible scar. It wasn't what was found that unsettled investigators. It was what wasn't found. The entire scene whispered of a sudden interruption, as if lives had simply been lifted out of existence while the rest of the world carried on unaware. All 3 women's personal belongings were inside. Cheryl Levitt's purse was in her bedroom, her bed neatly made, her car parked in the driveway. Susie's things were in her room, untouched. Stacy's belongings were also found, including her purse, clothing, and jewelry. None of them had taken anything that would indicate plans to leave. No keys, no overnight bags, no money. All 3 vehicles remained outside, undisturbed. The dog, a small Yorkie named Cinnamon, was still inside the house, anxious and alone. The television had been left on, creating a surreal backdrop of normalcy against an otherwise unexplainable disappearance. The front door was unlocked, a strange detail considering Cheryl's known habits. She was cautious, not the type to leave her home unsecured, especially at night. The porch light was broken, the glass shattered, and its cover missing. Someone had cleaned up the broken pieces, but no one could say when or why. The absence of a struggle was perplexing. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of a confrontation, no noise reported by neighbors. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if frozen in the exact moment something terrible occurred. Every detail suggested a sudden and silent removal, something that didn't align with ordinary criminal behavior. Theories emerged quickly, but few provided real answers. One possibility was that someone the women knew had entered the home and managed to gain their trust. This might explain the lack of forced entry or alarm. Another theory suggested they were taken at gunpoint, perhaps subdued and moved quickly, but this raised questions. Why wouldn't they scream? Why wasn't there any resistance, any trace of a scuffle? The scene offered no blood, no fingerprints out of place, no evidence of violence. It was as though the women had simply disappeared into thin air. Complicating matters further was the response in the critical early hours of the investigation. Before police were notified, several friends and family members entered the home, concerned about the women's sudden lack of contact. Out of worry and confusion, they attempted to clean areas of the home. The glass from the broken porch light was swept up. The answering machine was accessed, and at least one message, described as strange and sexual in nature, was accidentally deleted. These actions, though well-intentioned, may have wiped away vital clues. In a case where every small detail mattered, even the slightest disturbance to the original scene held significant weight. The phone calls that came through the answering machine further deepened the mystery. At least one of them was disturbing, containing inappropriate language and an unnerving tone. Whether it was a prank or something more serious remained uncertain. Some believed the call could have come from someone involved in the disappearance, possibly taunting or testing the waters. Unfortunately, with the message erased, that lead disappeared as well, just another thread cut short in an already tangled mystery. In the absence of physical evidence, investigators turned to behavioral patterns. They interviewed friends, family, co-workers, anyone who might provide insight into the lives of the women. Cheryl was described as quiet and hard-working, a woman who kept to herself and focused on her career and daughter. Susie was social and vibrant, well-liked by peers, with no known enemies. Stacy was similarly well-regarded, not known to be involved in any risky behavior. There was nothing in their recent actions to suggest danger was near. Some speculated that the broken porch light may have been the catalyst for the entire event. Perhaps it was shattered deliberately to draw someone outside, a trick to isolate a target. Others wondered if someone had been watching the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. But if that was the case, how had they managed to take all three women without leaving behind even a trace? The level of control and precision required for such an act made the theory both terrifying and plausible. The eerie calm of the house haunted investigators. It didn't feel like a crime scene. It felt like time had simply stopped. In most disappearances, there are clues, fingerprints, surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts. Here, there was nothing. It was a crime defined by absence, and every detail only added to the sense of unease. The more the house was studied, the less it gave up. It stood as a perfect mystery, offering no cooperation, no leads, just the echo of what once was. Even decades later, that house, though demolished years ago, remains etched into the minds of all who followed the case. Its silence still speaks, not in what it said, but in what it refused to reveal. And within that silence lies the chilling truth, that 3 lives were taken from it, completely, without sound, without struggle, and without a single clue left behind. Theories began to multiply in the weeks and months following the disappearance of the Springfield 3, but none brought clarity. Instead, each one cast a new shadow, adding layers to an already unsettling mystery. At the heart of every theory was a single haunting question. How could 3 people vanish without a trace from a house in the middle of a quiet neighborhood? One of the earliest and most persistent theories involved a possible abduction by someone known to the women. The lack of forced entry, the calm interior, and the absence of any clear signs of struggle led some to believe the perpetrator was invited in. This theory relied heavily on the idea that trust played a role, that someone exploited a personal connection to lower defenses. Yet no one in their close circle appeared to have the motive, means, or opportunity. Everyone close to the victims had alibis or showed no behavioral red flags. Law enforcement conducted hundreds of interviews, polygraph tests, and background checks, but nothing pointed decisively to a suspect. Another theory suggested a random predator, someone who either watched the house or stumbled upon it by chance. This line of thinking introduced a darker, more terrifying element, the idea that the abduction was opportunistic, perhaps carried out by a skilled and experienced offender. The level of control required to subdue 3 individuals without any witnesses or evidence suggested meticulous planning. However, random predators often leave behind mistakes, traces, patterns, or repeat behavior. In this case, there were no connections to similar crimes, and no credible suspects emerged with matching methods. It was as if this person, or persons, acted once and then disappeared into the void. One of the most widely discussed leads centered around Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and suspected murderer who had previously lived in Springfield. His criminal history, combined with his cryptic statements in later years, placed him firmly in the realm of suspicion. Cox once claimed that he knew what had happened to the 3 women, even going so far as to suggest they were dead and that their bodies would never be found. Despite the provocative nature of his statements, he never provided verifiable details, and without solid evidence, authorities could not act on mere words. Some believed he was seeking attention or attempting to insert himself into the case for notoriety. Others feared he might have been telling the truth. Another theory involved the possibility of a break-in that escalated. This theory posits that someone entered the home with the intent to burglarize, only to be surprised by the presence of the women. In a panic or premeditated shift in intent, the suspect could have taken control of the situation and abducted all three. Yet this scenario struggles to explain the absence of any struggle or noise. No neighbors reported anything suspicious that night. There were no screams, no sounds of a fight, nothing to suggest that violence had occurred inside or outside the house. Rumors swirled for years about potential drug connections or hidden secrets. Some speculated that Susie or Stacy may have known something they weren't supposed to know, or crossed paths with someone dangerous by accident. These ideas often stemmed from pure speculation, fueled by the human desire to impose order on chaos. But no credible links to drugs, organized crime, or hidden double lives were ever uncovered. The victims appeared to lead ordinary lives, with nothing in their histories to suggest they were living dangerously. Over time, fringe theories began to surface, dark, almost conspiratorial ideas that ranged from police cover-ups to trafficking rings. Some suggested that the investigation itself was compromised or that key pieces of evidence had been intentionally suppressed. While no substantial proof ever emerged to support these claims, the lack of answers gave space for such speculation to thrive. In any mystery where the trail runs cold, conspiracy finds fertile ground. These theories often did more to confuse the public than help the investigation, drawing attention away from more plausible lines of inquiry. A particularly chilling theory involved the notion that the bodies of the women might have been hidden in or around Springfield itself. Construction sites, nearby woods, and even parking structures were combed through over the years. One lead suggested the women had been buried beneath a parking garage, prompting a formal request to excavate the concrete. The city ultimately declined, citing a lack of probable cause. Despite public pressure, no excavation took place. That theory, like many others, faded into silence, leaving only more frustration behind. As time went on, the absence of evidence became its own form of presence, a constant reminder that something had been done with absolute precision. Theories lost momentum as new cases emerged and public attention waned. But for those who stayed close to the story, family members, investigators, and local residents, the unanswered questions still burned. They still wonder who knocked on the door that night, who entered that house, and how they left without leaving anything behind. Theories remain just that, possibilities floating in the void, waiting for a missing piece that may never come. Each shadow cast by a theory only deepens the darkness surrounding the case. And in that darkness, the voices of the Springfield Three remain unheard, eclipsed by silence, sustained only by memory, and haunted by the chilling reality that the truth might already be buried, somewhere too deep to reach. Years passed, but the case of the Springfield Three never faded completely from public consciousness. Even as new generations emerged and headlines changed, the story remained etched into the identity of the community. It became more than just an unsolved mystery. It became a wound that refused to heal. Memorials were held, vigils were organized, and missing person posters slowly transitioned from paper flyers on utility poles to digital artifacts shared on online forums. Yet, none of these efforts ever brought the one thing everyone wanted: resolution. The families of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall lived through decades of uncertainty. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary became a cruel reminder of what had been taken and never returned. The absence of answers created a different kind of suffering, one that didn't come from death itself, but from the inability to properly grieve. Closure is often found in truth, no matter how dark. Without it, the mind loops endlessly through the possibilities, wondering what could have been done differently or if a single overlooked clue might have made all the difference. Over time, leads dwindled and investigators retired. Some passed away with the case still unresolved, their files passed down like inherited burdens. Cold case units occasionally reopened the investigation, reviewing old evidence and re-interviewing witnesses, but each attempt ended with the same result: more questions. Forensics improved, DNA analysis advanced, and new databases were created to cross-reference unidentified remains, but none of these tools revealed a trace of the three women. Their names were checked against every discovery, but no match ever emerged. It was as if they had vanished from the world entirely, leaving no physical proof of their fate. Online communities picked up where the mainstream investigation left off. Amateur sleuths, true crime enthusiasts, and armchair detectives dedicated countless hours to combing through records, theorizing timelines, and analyzing details that might have been missed. Despite their passion and commitment, no revelation ever led to a breakthrough. Theories continued to circulate, often revisiting the same suspects and scenarios, but the absence of hard evidence remained an immovable barrier. Technology brought the case to a global audience, but it also magnified its coldness, the illusion that with so many eyes watching, the truth should have come by now. The house on Delmar Street, once an ordinary home, became an eerie landmark. Locals knew it well, and even those unfamiliar with the case could feel the weight of what had happened there. Over the years, the property changed hands, but the shadow of its history never lifted. To some, it was a reminder of danger hidden in plain sight. To others, it was a monument to the unanswered. What happened within those walls, or what might have happened just outside of them, remained one of Springfield's darkest questions. With the passage of time, new voices emerged: children of relatives, newer generations of law enforcement, young journalists eager to revisit the story. But even their fresh eyes and modern tools couldn't crack the silence that had solidified over decades. The case became an eerie standard in discussions about missing persons, often cited as one of the most chilling unsolved disappearances in American history. It wasn't just the mystery that disturbed people, it was the completeness of the void. No ransom notes, no bodies, no confession. Just 3 lives erased in an instant and never accounted for again. Public interest ebbed and flowed. Documentaries were made, podcast episodes aired, and the case occasionally trended on social media. But every resurgence ended the same way, with the same unanswered questions looping back into silence. Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy were remembered more as symbols of loss than individuals. Their faces were etched into collective memory, their names spoken with both reverence and sorrow. The lack of a final chapter haunted every telling of the story, turning their disappearance into something larger than life, an unsolvable riddle that mocked the very idea of closure. Despite the years, the case remains open. Somewhere, buried in evidence boxes or locked away in fading memories, there may still be a missing piece. But the longer time stretches on, the more difficult it becomes to separate hope from resignation. The world around the case changed, but the core of it remained frozen, an unbroken silence that withstood decades of voices trying to penetrate it. And in that silence, 3 names continue to echo: Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, Stacy McCall. Not as statistics, not as entries in a database, but as real people who walked into the night and never returned. Their story persists, not because of what is known, but because of everything that is not. No one saw what happened. No one heard their final moments. And to this day, no one has answered the question that has haunted Springfield since that warm June morning in 1992. How do 3 people simply disappear from the face of the earth? Until that question is answered, the story remains unfinished. And the silence, however deafening, remains unbroken. End of Story 1. Story 2. The Villisca Axe Murders, 1912, Iowa. In the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, 8 people were slaughtered in their sleep, 6 of them innocent children. The killer used an axe, yet not a single scream was heard that night. What followed was a century of rumors, suspects, seances, and sealed lips. No arrests. No justice. Just blood, silence, and the lingering feeling that evil once entered through an unlocked door and never truly left. Tonight, we return to that haunted house, where the walls remember everything but say nothing. Villisca, Iowa, in 1912 was the kind of small town where doors were left unlocked, neighbors greeted each other by name, and Sunday service was the highlight of the week. That illusion of safety shattered forever in the early hours of June 10th, when the Moore family home became the scene of one of the most brutal and chilling unsolved crimes in American history. 8 people, including 6 children, were murdered in their sleep with an axe. There were no witnesses, no confessions, no justice. Josiah Moore was a respected businessman in Villisca. Along with his wife Sarah and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, they lived in a modest white house that never gave any outward sign of what would soon unfold inside it. On the evening of June 9th, the Moore family attended a church event. With them were 2 young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who were invited to spend the night as house guests. That decision sealed their fate. By the morning of June 10th, concern began to grow when no one from the Moore household emerged. A neighbor noticed the silence and eventually called for help. What authorities found inside the home was a scene of unimaginable horror. All 8 victims had been brutally bludgeoned to death with the blunt end of an axe. The weapon belonged to Josiah Moore himself. It was later found in the guest room, bloodied and left behind, as if the killer wanted it to be discovered. The killer had entered the house sometime after midnight, likely through an unlocked door. One by one, the victims were attacked as they slept. Josiah received the most blows, his face rendered unrecognizable. Sarah and the children followed, each suffering multiple strikes to the head. The Stillinger sisters, sleeping in the guest room, were also killed, though evidence suggested that one of the girls may have awakened moments before her death. There were no screams, no sounds heard by neighbors, nothing that indicated a violent massacre had taken place just yards away. The details of the crime scene deepened the mystery. All mirrors in the house had been covered with cloth. The windows were similarly obscured. A piece of cooked bacon was found wrapped in a cloth next to the axe, and an uneaten plate of food sat at the kitchen table, as if the killer had paused to eat or pretend to. A kerosene lamp with the wick turned down low was found at the foot of the bed in several rooms, providing the murderer with just enough light to move through the house without alerting the victims. Every clock had been stopped. Every door had been locked behind the killer upon exit. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables were taken. No clear motive emerged. The killer's actions seemed methodical and eerily calm, not the work of someone in a frenzy or acting out of sudden rage. The placement of the bodies, the ritualistic covering of mirrors, and the effort to block all windows gave the crime a ceremonial or symbolic air. Yet no one could say what message, if any, had been intended. The brutality was staggering. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, the ceilings, the bedding. Yet the precision with which the killings were carried out indicated familiarity with the layout of the house. The killer knew how to move silently. He had the patience to wait until everyone was asleep. He had the presence of mind to clean the murder weapon and stage the house in a grotesque post-mortem still life. And then he vanished. As word spread, the town of Villisca plunged into panic. In a matter of hours, it transformed from a peaceful farming community into a place of fear and suspicion. Parents kept their children indoors. Doors that had never been locked were now bolted shut. Rumors spread like wildfire, and everyone had a theory. Some believed the killer was a drifter passing through. Others were certain it had to be someone local, someone who had blended into the crowd the next morning without raising suspicion. The sheer randomness and savagery of the act shattered any sense of comfort the town once held. People who had known each other their entire lives now looked at one another with mistrust. The idea that someone capable of such horror could still be among them, walking the same streets, attending the same churches, was too much to bear. But the evidence was sparse, and the trail, even from the beginning, was already growing cold. Despite the intensity of the initial investigation, no one was arrested in those early days. Theories multiplied, but facts remained scarce. The town, once unified by neighborly warmth, now stood divided by uncertainty and dread. What had happened inside the Moore home that night wasn't just a crime. It was a fracture in the town's identity, a violent intrusion into the heart of normalcy. More than a century later, the questions remain the same. Who entered that house in the dead of night? Why were those specific people chosen? How could such a devastating act be committed without a single soul noticing? In Villisca, the night of June 9, 1912, never truly ended. It lives on in the silence of a house that still stands, in the unanswered questions whispered on every tour, and in the chilling truth that sometimes the most disturbing evil wears no face and leaves no trace. News of the murders spread rapidly across Villisca, turning a peaceful rural town into a center of panic, suspicion, and grief. In a place where people once left doors unlocked and neighbors trusted each other without question, a wave of collective paranoia swept through the community. Residents began locking their homes, sleeping with weapons nearby, and whispering about possible suspects behind closed curtains. The brutal slaying of an entire family, and 2 innocent visiting children, was something no one had imagined could ever happen there. But now it had, and the terror it left behind was just beginning. The crime scene was chaotic from the moment it was discovered. Before authorities could properly secure the house, dozens of curious neighbors had already walked through the blood-stained rooms. Some even touched the victims, moved objects, or took items as souvenirs. The destruction of potential evidence began almost immediately. Law enforcement, unequipped for a crime of this magnitude, lacked the training to manage such a scene. No photographs were taken. No fingerprints were collected. Any forensic clues that could have pointed to the killer were lost in the frenzy. The house on East 2nd Street quickly became both a spectacle and a symbol of horror. People lined up outside just to catch a glimpse of the infamous property. Some broke in after dark to satisfy their morbid curiosity. Stories began to circulate about odd sights and sounds near the home. Children claimed they saw ghostly figures in the windows. Adults whispered about curses. For many, the very walls of the Moore home seemed soaked not just in blood, but in something far more sinister, something unnatural. Within days, the list of suspects began to grow. Suspicion fell on strangers first, transients, drifters, and hobos who passed through town on the nearby railroad lines. Some believed the killer had hopped off a freight train, committed the murders, and vanished before dawn. Others thought it had to be someone from Villisca itself, someone who knew the family, the layout of the home, and their movements that day. As fear deepened, the boundaries between logic and paranoia began to blur. Accusations began to fly in every direction. Long-standing grudges between families resurfaced. Envy, betrayal, and small-town politics spilled into the investigation. Even close friends of the Moore family were not immune from suspicion. The town's own social fabric began to unravel. Everyone was watching everyone else. What began as a search for justice became a hunt for anyone to blame. Theories multiplied quickly. Some speculated that Josiah Moore had enemies in business, rivals who might have wanted revenge. Others pointed to his former employer, a powerful figure in town who reportedly held a grudge after Moore left his company to start his own. Whispers of affairs, secret meetings, and hidden motives became fuel for the fire. The truth was buried under layers of speculation, and the killer, if he or she had ever truly been close, remained silent. Religious tension also entered the narrative. When Reverend George Kelly, a visiting preacher with a troubling past and a bizarre obsession with the crime, became a person of interest, many in town turned their focus on him. Known for erratic behavior and a fascination with murder, Kelly inserted himself into the investigation and even confessed, though his story changed multiple times and was riddled with inconsistencies. His eventual trial ended in acquittal, and no other suspect was ever formally charged. As days turned to weeks and weeks into months, the initial intensity of the investigation began to fade. The media, which had flooded into Villisca to report on the carnage, moved on to other stories. The town was left with nothing but broken families, unanswered questions, and a legacy of trauma. The unsolved nature of the murders meant that every creak in the floor, every stranger passing through, every rumor that surfaced was another spark in a town already scorched by fear. Children who had grown up in Villisca learned the story as both cautionary tale and local folklore. Parents warned them not to talk to outsiders. Locks became a standard feature on every home. The Moore house, once filled with laughter and family life, stood as a dark reminder of what had been lost. Over the years, its windows were boarded up, its paint peeled, and the stories surrounding it only grew darker. The psychological toll on the community was immense. People who had lived in Villisca their entire lives moved away. Others withdrew from public life altogether. Trust among neighbors eroded. A once hopeful town began to feel cursed, as though something malevolent had passed through and marked it forever. The murders had not just taken lives. They had taken the town's innocence, its safety, and its belief that evil could be kept outside. Decades passed, but the fear never fully left. Residents still speak of the Villisca axe murders in hushed tones. Tourists now visit the old Moore house, which has been restored and opened for overnight stays. Some seek ghosts. Others seek answers. But those who lived through the aftermath know that the most haunting thing about Villisca is not what's seen or heard in the dark, but what was never revealed in the light. As the initial shock of the Villisca axe murders began to settle into a permanent scar on the town, the investigation spiraled into confusion. With no clear evidence, the case quickly morphed into a breeding ground for speculation, personal vendettas, and obsessive theories. Local law enforcement, overwhelmed by the scale and brutality of the crime, found themselves chasing shadows, while the public, desperate for answers, clung to any theory that offered the illusion of resolution. One of the most prominent suspects was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a deeply troubled past. He had a history of mental instability, an obsessive personality, and disturbing behaviors, including voyeurism and sending lewd letters. What made him a person of interest was his erratic involvement with the case. He attended the victims' funerals, inserted himself into community discussions, and even confessed to the murders. Yet, his confession was inconsistent and bizarre. He claimed to have heard God's voice commanding him to kill, but then retracted his statement. His trial was highly publicized, yet the evidence was purely circumstantial, and after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted him. No one else was charged afterward, and this outcome left the town even more frustrated and haunted by the ambiguity. Other suspects emerged from the murky depths of hearsay and circumstantial allegations. Frank F. Jones, a wealthy and influential state senator who had once employed Josiah Moore, was a key figure in the rumors. Moore had allegedly left Jones's business on bitter terms, even taking away a major client. The theory went that Jones, enraged by the betrayal, hired someone, possibly William Blackie Mansfield, a known serial killer with a history of using axes, to commit the murder. Though investigators briefly pursued this lead, it was never substantiated. Mansfield had alibis, and despite the similarities between the Villisca murders and other crimes he was suspected of, no direct link could be made. The case also drew the attention of private investigators, including one particularly obsessed detective named James Wilkerson, who was convinced that Jones was behind it all. Wilkerson stirred public opinion by giving interviews and speeches, accusing Jones of orchestrating the murders and manipulating the justice system. His theory gained traction among many in Villisca, further fueling division within the community. Yet, he too could provide no solid evidence. Over time, his credibility waned, and his obsession came to be seen as more of a personal crusade than a serious contribution to the case. The lack of physical evidence continued to cripple every investigation. The crime scene had been so badly contaminated by curious onlookers and bungled police procedures that any forensic advantage was lost before it even began. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon conclusively tied to a suspect, and no eyewitnesses. The case sat in limbo, open but cold, year after year, as any hope of a clean resolution faded. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of the murders and their aftermath extended far beyond Villisca. True crime enthusiasts, amateur detectives, and paranormal investigators began to flock to the story. It was featured in newspapers, radio shows, books, and later documentaries. Each retelling added its own twist, its own favored suspect, its own theory. The case became a canvas onto which people projected their fears, frustrations, and fascinations with evil. For some, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved, a perfect true crime mystery made more chilling by the lack of answers. For others, it was a cautionary tale about the failures of law enforcement, the dangers of mass hysteria, and the fragility of justice in small communities. The fact that children had been among the victims made the crime especially heinous, and for many, unforgivable. The desire for closure never waned, but the means to achieve it had long been squandered. In time, the story of Villisca turned into something larger than the event itself. It became a cultural touchstone in the American true crime lexicon, an enduring symbol of a case that defied explanation. It haunted not just the town, but generations of people who came across it in articles, books, and late-night retellings. The house where it happened was preserved and eventually transformed into a true crime museum and overnight tourist attraction, allowing thrill-seekers to sleep where the victims once lived and died. Some claimed to experience supernatural phenomena, unexplained footsteps, voices, or feelings of dread, but the real horror lay in the facts, not the folklore. Over the years, new forensic technologies were discussed as potential tools for reopening the case. DNA testing, for instance, offered a sliver of hope that some remaining evidence, perhaps a preserved piece of clothing or latent print, might still yield a clue. But as time went on, the likelihood of any such breakthrough diminished. Whatever secrets the killer held were either taken to the grave or remain hidden, protected by the passage of time and the failure of early justice. What remains is a chilling reminder of how a single night can unravel a town, destroy lives, and ignite a century-long search for truth that may never be found. The Villisca Axe murders became more than just a crime. They became a shadow that still clings to the edges of American memory, proof that sometimes the most disturbing stories are the ones that end without answers. The Villisca Axe murders did not merely carve a wound into the quiet town of Villisca. They carved a space in American consciousness where fear, doubt, and darkness festered for generations. What took place in the Moore residence that June night in 1912 has continued to haunt not just the descendants of those affected, but also anyone who stumbles upon the mystery. The absence of closure transformed the crime into a perpetual echo, a historical anomaly where the brutality of the act remains intact, while justice continues to decay. In the years following the murders, Villisca was never the same. The tight-knit community, once defined by its simple routines and predictable rhythms, became fractured. Distrust seeped into everyday life. Neighbors who had once shared fences and borrowed sugar now cast suspicious glances toward each other. Rumors replaced facts, and accusations became currency. The sense of safety that once accompanied small-town living evaporated, replaced by a chilling uncertainty about what people, any people, might be capable of behind closed doors. The Moore house, instead of fading into anonymity, became a grim landmark. No matter how many families moved in or how many years passed, the story clung to its walls. Some residents reported unease, others moved out abruptly, unable to tolerate the atmosphere. Over time, the home was abandoned entirely, left to decay with its secrets. But even as it sat empty, its reputation grew. It became a subject of whispered legends and ghost stories, especially among local children, who dared each other to approach it as a test of bravery. As public fascination with true crime evolved, Villisca's story found new life in books, documentaries, podcasts, and online forums. With each generation, a fresh wave of amateur sleuths, historians, and paranormal investigators dug into the case, convinced they could uncover something new. Some overlooked clue, some missed detail that would explain it all. Yet time has only widened the distance between what is known and what is provable. The evidence, poorly preserved and contaminated from the start, offers little help. Witnesses are long gone. Official records are incomplete. Even the suspects, once so vigorously debated, have passed into history without a clear verdict on their guilt or innocence. The house was eventually restored and preserved as a historical site. Now known as the Villisca Axe Murder House, it attracts thousands of visitors each year. Some come to learn about the case, others come in search of something more metaphysical. Stories of supernatural activity persist, accounts of disembodied voices, doors closing on their own, or feelings of dread in specific rooms. For many, the house represents not just a crime scene, but a portal into the unresolved, a place where questions linger louder than any answers. But beyond the whispers of ghosts and the pull of the unknown, the story of Villisca resonates because of its very real horror. 8 lives were violently ended in the sanctity of a home, including 6 innocent children. The brutality of the crime, the use of an axe, the methodical nature of the killings, and the peculiar care the murderer took in covering mirrors and victims, adds a layer of intentional cruelty that defies comprehension. It suggests not just violence, but a deeply disturbed mind, one that walked into a quiet home and committed an atrocity without hesitation. The legacy of the Villisca murders also serves as a grim benchmark in American criminal history. It exemplifies the limitations of early 20th century forensic science and the consequences of poorly managed crime scenes. It underscores how quickly public opinion can spiral into hysteria, especially when answers are elusive. And it shows how the need for closure often pushes people to construct narratives that fit their fears, even in the absence of facts. Today, the town of Villisca still exists, quieter and smaller than before, but never truly free of what happened over a century ago. The murder house remains a macabre destination, drawing attention far beyond what its population or size would suggest. The crime continues to be studied in criminology courses, explored in psychological analyses, and used as a cautionary tale for investigative professionals. Perhaps most chilling of all is the silence that remains. It is the silence of a family that never spoke again, a town that still cannot explain, and a case that may never be closed. That silence, louder than any scream, is what continues to draw people to Villisca. Not for thrills or answers, but for the echo of a mystery that continues to resist the passing of time. In a world where crimes are usually catalogued, solved, and filed away, the Villisca Axe murders stand as a stark anomaly, unresolved, unhealed, and unrelenting. It is a reminder that some evils do not conclude with handcuffs or verdicts. Some simply remain, stretching across decades, casting long shadows that even daylight cannot dispel. End of Story 2. Story 3. The Colonial Parkway Murders, 1986 to 1989, Virginia. 4 couples. 4 brutal murders. A quiet stretch of road turned into a sinister hunting ground. Decades later, the Colonial Parkway murders remain one of Virginia's most chilling unsolved mysteries, where love met violence and the killer vanished without a trace. Tonight, we delve into the eerie case that still haunts the shadows of the Colonial Parkway. The Colonial Parkway murders began in the mid-1980s, marking a dark and terrifying chapter in Virginia's history. Between 1986 and 1989, a series of 4 double murders took place along a quiet, scenic stretch of road known as the Colonial Parkway, an area popular for its peaceful views and romantic getaways. These murders shared chilling similarities. Young couples were found dead in or near their cars, secluded in areas where they would have expected privacy and safety. The brutal nature of the killings sent shockwaves through the local communities and ignited a prolonged investigation, yet the identity of the killer or killers remains a mystery. The first known victims were Rebecca Dowski, 22, and Timothy Barton, 21, both students at the College of William and Mary. On the night of October 15, 1986, they went out on a date and never returned home. Their bodies were discovered the next day in a parked car along the Colonial Parkway. Both had been strangled, and the crime scene bore signs of sexual assault. The couple's disappearance and subsequent discovery set off alarms throughout Virginia. The campus community was devastated, and law enforcement scrambled to find any leads. The brutality and boldness of the attack in a well-frequented area disturbed many, signaling that the murderer was likely someone who could operate with chilling confidence. Just 2 years later, in 1988, another couple fell victim under eerily similar circumstances. Suzanne Susie Paxton, 20, and Jonathan Wright, 21, were found dead in their car, also along the Colonial Parkway. Their bodies were discovered partially covered, and both had suffered severe trauma. Once again, there was evidence of sexual assault, and the manner of death included strangulation and blunt force trauma. The similarities to the previous murders led investigators to strongly suspect a connection between the cases, raising fears that a serial killer was active in the region. The third and fourth attacks came in quick succession during 1989, intensifying the community's fear and frustration. The victims were two more young couples, Morgan Dana Harrington and her boyfriend, and then a final couple whose names remain less publicized due to ongoing investigations and family privacy. In each case, the couples were alone, seeking privacy in a quiet and picturesque spot, only to be violently attacked. The pattern was clear. The killer targeted young lovers secluded in remote areas along the same stretch of highway. Each attack was methodical and ruthless, indicating that the perpetrator was careful to choose moments and locations that minimized the risk of interruption or detection. What made these crimes particularly perplexing was the killer's ability to evade capture despite the heightened alertness of law enforcement. Local police departments worked tirelessly, alongside the FBI, pooling resources and expertise. Crime scenes were meticulously combed for evidence, and every lead was pursued. However, despite the technological advances of the late 1980s, such as the emerging use of DNA testing, investigators struggled to find concrete forensic evidence that could point to a suspect. The killer had left behind few clues, a hallmark of a calculating and experienced perpetrator. The psychological impact on the surrounding communities was profound. College campuses in Williamsburg, tourist destinations near Colonial Williamsburg, and the towns nearby were all affected. Couples hesitated to visit the parkway, and the area's reputation shifted from a peaceful retreat to a place tinged with danger and fear. Public warnings were issued, and safety measures encouraged, but the murders cast a long shadow over the region. Adding to the complexity was the killer's apparent ability to avoid detection despite multiple sightings and near misses. Some witnesses reported seeing suspicious individuals in the area, while others mentioned cars or strangers behaving oddly near the time of the disappearances. Unfortunately, none of these accounts produced a solid lead. The killer's elusive nature led to various theories, including the possibility of multiple offenders or someone with an intimate knowledge of the local geography and law enforcement practices. Despite the gruesome pattern, the murders were never officially linked to a single individual through charges or convictions. The case remained open, frustrating families of victims and investigators alike. Over time, new forensic techniques were applied, including DNA testing from preserved evidence, but no definitive match emerged. Suspects were questioned and even arrested at times, but insufficient evidence prevented any legal closure. The Colonial Parkway murders remain among the most perplexing cold cases in American criminal history. The uncertainty surrounding these murders left an indelible mark. While the initial shock gave way to a lingering dread, the story has not faded from public memory. The Colonial Parkway, once just a scenic roadway, became synonymous with fear, loss, and unanswered questions. The unanswered who and why continue to haunt the investigation, with every new lead offering a glimmer of hope yet ultimately reinforcing the case's frustrating mystery. This first section, focusing on the chronology and initial impact of the Colonial Parkway murders, sets the foundation for understanding the terror that gripped Virginia in the late 1980s. It reveals the brutal pattern, the early investigative efforts, and the deep sense of vulnerability felt by the victims' families and the community. The murders were not random acts of violence. They were calculated attacks targeting the intimate moments of young couples. The elusive nature of the killer highlights the challenges law enforcement faced, struggling against a shadowy presence that seemed always one step ahead. The stage is set for a deeper exploration into the victims' lives, the investigation's twists and turns, and the haunting legacy that these murders left behind. The Colonial Parkway murders remain an unsettling chapter in true crime history, where darkness fell over a quiet road and a ruthless predator vanished without a trace. The victims of the Colonial Parkway murders were all young couples, each with their own hopes, dreams, and futures tragically cut short. Understanding who these individuals were and the circumstances surrounding their deaths provides a human dimension to a case often reduced to statistics and cold facts. These were not just names on a list or bodies found in remote locations. They were people with families, friends, and lives filled with promise. Rebecca Dowski and Timothy Barton were the first known victims. Both were students at the College of William and Mary, a prestigious institution located near the Colonial Parkway. Rebecca, 22 years old, was described by friends and family as bright and ambitious, someone deeply invested in her studies and her future. Timothy, 21, shared similar aspirations, with a close-knit circle of friends and a family who remembered him as kind and thoughtful. On the evening of October 15, 1986, Rebecca and Timothy left for what should have been a simple date night. They never returned. Their bodies were discovered the following day in a parked car along the Colonial Parkway, the scene marked by violence that shattered the tranquility they sought. The shock rippled through the college and the community as people grappled with the senselessness of the crime. 2 years later, the lives of Suzanne Paxton and Jonathan Wright ended in a similar tragedy. Suzanne was 20 years old, a student known for her lively personality and close friendships. Jonathan, 21, was her boyfriend, sharing in the joys and struggles of young adulthood. The couple's relationship was marked by normalcy and affection, making their violent deaths all the more jarring. Found in their car, both bore the scars of an attack that seemed personal in its brutality. Their deaths not only echoed the horror of Rebecca and Timothy's, but deepened the suspicion that a serial predator was stalking the parkway. Families and friends mourned deeply, their grief compounded by the mystery surrounding the killer's identity. The subsequent victims, though less publicly discussed, were similarly young couples whose lives were violently ended. Each had sought privacy in the quiet stretches of the Colonial Parkway, a place where they expected to find solitude and intimacy away from the pressures of daily life. Instead, they encountered a ruthless force that shattered those moments and left behind a trail of grief. The nature of the attacks suggested a cold calculation by the killer, someone who targeted couples in vulnerable moments, aware that the remoteness would limit the chances of interruption or rescue. A pattern emerged from the lives and deaths of these victims. The killer appeared to prey on couples who were emotionally connected, seeking moments alone together in isolated areas. The choice of location was significant. The Colonial Parkway was known for its scenic beauty and romantic appeal, a place where couples might go to escape and enjoy each other's company. This familiarity with the area may have given the killer an advantage, allowing him to select spots where he could act undetected and swiftly. The emotional toll on families and loved ones was profound and lasting. For many, the uncertainty of the killer's identity only deepened their pain. Without closure, they were left to grapple with questions that might never be answered. The initial shock was compounded by the lingering fear that justice might never be served. Families of the victims became vocal advocates for continued investigations, refusing to let the cases fade into obscurity. Their efforts helped keep the murders in the public eye, urging law enforcement to persist despite the challenges. Friends and acquaintances of the victims also felt the weight of these crimes deeply. College campuses, usually places of learning and growth, were overshadowed by fear and suspicion. Students became wary of going out alone or driving along the parkway at night. The murders disrupted a sense of safety that had once been taken for granted. This collective trauma extended beyond immediate circles, affecting communities across Virginia. The personal stories of the victims also highlighted the tragedy of lost potential. Young lives interrupted just as they were beginning to forge their paths. Educational and career ambitions cut short. Relationships and families left incomplete. Each victim represented a narrative that was suddenly and violently ended. Their memories became a focal point for those seeking justice and understanding. Despite the horror, the victims' lives were often celebrated and remembered with love and respect. Memorials and tributes were held, and their stories were shared to humanize the statistics and to remind the public of the individuals behind the headlines. Their families worked tirelessly to keep their memories alive, sometimes collaborating with investigators to provide insights into their loved ones' last days. This section reveals the deeply personal and heartbreaking aspects of the Colonial Parkway murders. The victims were more than just targets. They were beloved individuals whose lives were stolen in a manner that shattered the peace of those around them. The connection between the victims through their demographics and the nature of their deaths paints a grim picture of a predator who exploited moments of intimacy and vulnerability. By understanding the victims' lives and relationships, the case becomes more than just an unsolved mystery. It becomes a story of human loss and resilience. The pain of the families and friends continues to resonate, underscoring the urgency for answers. Their stories demand that the victims are remembered not as mere names in a file, but as people who deserved safety, love, and justice. In sum, the victims of the Colonial Parkway murders were young couples seeking private moments that ended in unimaginable violence. Their lives, their dreams, and their futures were cut short by a killer who remains unknown. This unresolved tragedy leaves behind a legacy of grief and questions, compelling those who remember them to seek justice and closure. The investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders was one of the most extensive and complex in Virginia's history, involving multiple law enforcement agencies, including the FBI. From the outset, the cases presented a perplexing challenge: a series of violent deaths spanning several years, all linked by location and victim profile but lacking clear motives or suspects. Forensic evidence was scarce and often compromised by the remote outdoor locations where the victims were found. In the 1980s, DNA analysis was still in its infancy, limiting the ability of investigators to extract definitive clues from physical evidence. However, investigators meticulously collected what they could: fibers, hair samples, and anything that might later be tested as forensic science advanced. Initial investigations focused heavily on known offenders in the region who matched the profile of someone capable of such crimes. The killer appeared to be methodical and calculating, targeting young couples in isolated settings and leaving little evidence behind. The brutality of the murders suggested deep-seated rage or psychopathy, but without direct witnesses or solid leads, identifying a suspect proved elusive. Law enforcement interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, neighbors, park employees, and locals who frequented the Colonial Parkway. They sought to uncover anyone who might have seen suspicious activity or individuals near the crime scenes around the times of the murders. Despite these efforts, no credible sightings or leads emerged that pointed decisively to a perpetrator. Several suspects were brought under scrutiny over the years. One prominent figure was a man named Raymond Molesky, who was considered a possible suspect due to his criminal history and proximity to the areas. Molesky was known to have violent tendencies, but investigations failed to produce concrete evidence linking him to the murders. He consistently denied involvement, and without physical evidence, charges could not be filed. Another person of interest was a drifter named Earl Talbot, who was suspected in several other violent crimes in the region during the late 1980s. His transient lifestyle and reputation raised suspicions, but like Molesky, there was no definitive proof connecting him to the Colonial Parkway murders. Talbot's death in the early 1990s effectively ended inquiries into his possible role. The investigation also considered the possibility that the murders were committed by a serial killer with knowledge of the area and an ability to evade capture. This theory was bolstered by the similar victim profiles and the geographic clustering along the Colonial Parkway. The FBI and local authorities collaborated extensively, sharing information and cross-referencing cases to establish a pattern. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic technology rekindled hopes of breakthroughs. DNA testing became more sophisticated, allowing investigators to revisit old evidence in search of new leads. Samples from the crime scenes were re-examined, and databases were cross-checked to identify potential matches. While this renewed effort yielded some promising leads, none ultimately led to an arrest or conviction. Public interest in the case also played a significant role in the ongoing investigation. The murders received considerable media attention, especially during anniversaries or when new forensic methods were announced. This public scrutiny kept pressure on law enforcement to persist despite the challenges. Family members of the victims often engaged with the media and the authorities, seeking justice and answers. In addition to law enforcement efforts, several independent investigators and true crime enthusiasts have taken an interest in the Colonial Parkway murders. Books, documentaries, and podcasts have explored the case in depth, analyzing evidence, suspects, and theories. These efforts have helped maintain awareness and generate fresh perspectives, but none have led to a definitive resolution. One particularly frustrating aspect for investigators was the lack of a clear motive. Unlike many violent crimes driven by personal vendettas, financial gain, or domestic disputes, the Colonial Parkway killings seemed senseless and random. The victims were unrelated except for their status as young couples. This lack of an obvious motive complicated efforts to narrow down suspects or anticipate future actions. Some experts speculated that the killer may have been driven by a twisted desire to control or punish couples, possibly rooted in psychological trauma or deep-seated anger. Others suggested that the murders could be linked to a more complex criminal enterprise or personal vendetta that was never uncovered. Without more evidence, these theories remain speculative. The persistence of the case into the modern era illustrates the difficulty of solving crimes that happen in isolated settings with minimal witnesses. The lack of surveillance technology at the time, combined with the killer's apparent caution, created a near-perfect scenario for an elusive perpetrator. Despite numerous investigations and renewed forensic attempts, the Colonial Parkway murders remain officially unsolved. The killer's identity continues to elude law enforcement, and the case serves as a chilling reminder of the limits of criminal justice when faced with silence and shadows. The impact on the community was profound, with a lingering sense of fear and mistrust. Couples avoided the Colonial Parkway after dark, and locals remained vigilant, wary of any unfamiliar presence. The murders became part of the local lore, a dark chapter in the history of Virginia's scenic roadway. In conclusion, the investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders was marked by exhaustive efforts, intermittent leads, and technological advancements that, while promising, failed to crack the case. Multiple suspects emerged and faded, and despite intense scrutiny, the truth behind the murders remains locked away. The unresolved nature of these crimes leaves open wounds for families, unanswered questions for investigators, and an eerie silence where justice has yet to be served. The enduring mystery of the Colonial Parkway murders continues to captivate both law enforcement and the public, fueling a complex mixture of fear, speculation, and unresolved grief. Decades after the first killings, the case remains a haunting enigma, one that symbolizes the profound challenge of bringing justice to victims when evidence is scarce and suspects remain hidden in the shadows. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Colonial Parkway murders is the complete absence of closure. Families of the victims still live with unanswered questions and painful what-ifs. The unknown fate of the killer creates an ever-present tension, the possibility that someone responsible for such brutality could still be free. This lack of resolution has transformed the case from a series of isolated tragedies into a collective wound for the community and beyond. The unsolved nature of the murders has also given rise to numerous theories and conjectures. Some propose that the perpetrator may have been a transient or someone who died shortly after the crimes, eliminating any possibility of prosecution. Others speculate that the killer may have moved away, changing identities to escape detection. The idea that the murders were the work of a lone individual is also questioned. Some experts argue the possibility of multiple offenders or copycat crimes designed to mimic the original killings. Another angle considers whether the killer might have had connections to law enforcement or local authorities. This theory stems from the perpetrator's apparent knowledge of the parkway's layout, secluded spots, and the victim's habits. Such knowledge could have enabled the killer to plan and execute the crimes with chilling efficiency while avoiding suspicion. However, no credible evidence has ever emerged to support this theory, and it remains part of the speculative landscape surrounding the case. The psychological profile of the killer, developed by behavioral experts, paints a disturbing picture of a person driven by control and sadism. The calculated nature of the attacks, the targeting of young couples, and the methodical manner of the killings suggest a predator who derived satisfaction from instilling fear and asserting dominance. This profile aligns with that of a serial offender with deep-rooted psychological issues, likely harboring resentment toward intimacy or relationships. Yet, the absence of physical evidence makes confirming these assessments difficult. The Colonial Parkway murders have had a lasting impact on the broader criminal justice system, highlighting the importance of advancements in forensic science and investigative techniques. The case's timeline spans an era when many of today's tools, such as rapid DNA analysis, widespread surveillance, and digital databases, were unavailable or in their infancy. This gap underscores how technology can be both a barrier and a breakthrough in solving cold cases. In recent years, law enforcement agencies have revisited the case, using modern methods such as genealogical DNA testing, which has solved numerous cold cases across the country. Samples from the Colonial Parkway crime scenes have been re-examined, but as of now, no definitive matches have emerged. This ongoing effort reflects the commitment of investigators who refuse to let the case be forgotten, fueled by a promise to victims' families that justice remains a priority. Public interest and media coverage have also played critical roles in keeping the Colonial Parkway murders in the spotlight. Documentaries, podcasts, and books have explored the case from multiple angles, often interviewing relatives, experts, and investigators. This exposure has kept the story alive in popular culture, ensuring it remains part of the conversation about unsolved crimes and the quest for justice. Some theorists and amateur sleuths continue to analyze the evidence, attempting to piece together overlooked clues or identify suspects. The emotional toll on the community is still palpable. The Colonial Parkway, once a symbol of peaceful escape and scenic beauty, carries a dark legacy. For many residents and visitors, the road evokes caution and discomfort rather than relaxation. The knowledge that a killer used this route to prey on vulnerable couples instills a persistent wariness. The murders disrupted the sense of safety, changing how the area was perceived and used. Despite the decades that have passed, the Colonial Parkway murders continue to serve as a grim reminder of the fragility of safety and the elusive nature of justice. The case exemplifies the challenges faced by law enforcement in rural or isolated areas, where limited witnesses and environmental factors can hinder investigations. It also highlights the human cost behind the headlines, the shattered lives, the families seeking answers, and the communities grappling with trauma. In reflecting on this cold case, one is left with a profound sense of loss and unanswered questions. Who was the killer? What drove them to commit such horrific acts? Could justice still be served after all this time? These questions linger, underscoring the enduring mystery that has haunted the Colonial Parkway for nearly 4 decades. The story of the Colonial Parkway murders is not just about the crimes themselves, but about the lasting impact on those left behind and the tireless pursuit of truth. While the darkness surrounding the case remains, so too does the hope that one day, the silence will be broken, the mystery solved, and justice finally delivered to the victims and their families. Until that day comes, the Colonial Parkway murders stand as a chilling testament to the unknown dangers that can lurk even in the most scenic and serene places, a haunting chapter in the annals of true crime that refuses to fade away. End of Story 3. Story 4. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, 1959, Russia, U.S. Connection. The Yuba County 5, 1978, California. In the quiet mountains of Northern California, 5 young men vanished without a trace after a simple basketball game, only to be found months later in a chilling puzzle of starvation, freezing cold, and inexplicable deaths. No clear cause, no signs of foul play, just a haunting mystery that baffles investigators to this day. What truly happened to the Yuba County 5? A story so disturbing, it will linger in your mind long after you've drifted to sleep. 5 young men, full of life and promise, left a basketball game in Yuba County, California, on a cold February evening in 1978. Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Weiher, and Gary Mathias were all members of the local college community, attending Sierra College. What seemed like an ordinary night would soon turn into one of the most baffling and haunting mysteries in American true crime history, the case of the Yuba County Five. The group had gone to watch a basketball game in the town of Yuba City, just north of Sacramento. After the game, they planned to return home, but none of them would be seen alive again. Their disappearance was first noticed when the men failed to show up for their classes and work the following day. This unusual absence prompted friends and family to notify authorities, and a search was launched. The car, a 1973 Mercury Montego, was found abandoned on a remote mountain road near the small town of Oregon House, in the northern foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The location was puzzling. It was not on any direct route back to their homes or school, but rather a treacherous stretch of winding roads known as New Bullard's Bar Road. This area was infamous for its dense forests, steep cliffs, and icy winter conditions. The car was discovered with its engine running, lights on, and radio playing. Inside, the vehicle's doors were locked, and the keys were missing. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. The belongings of the men were found inside the car, including their wallets, coats, and backpacks, suggesting they left suddenly or under duress. The abandoned car raised questions. Why would 5 healthy young men leave a running car in the middle of nowhere, in freezing conditions, with no preparation for an extended stay outdoors? Initial search efforts were focused on the immediate area around the car, but no trace of the men was found. Authorities expanded the search to nearby mountains, valleys, and rivers, using helicopters, dogs, and volunteers. However, the harsh winter weather slowed down progress. Snowfall blanketed the ground, making tracks difficult to follow and hiding any signs of human presence. This environmental barrier would play a critical role in the mystery that unfolded. Over the following months, the search intensified. Investigators combed through wilderness and cabins in the region. Yet, there were no immediate leads, no eyewitness accounts, and no clues pointing to foul play. It was as if the men had vanished into thin air. The official investigation remained open, but with no solid evidence, it gradually faded from public attention. The circumstances surrounding their disappearance were bizarre. None of the men had any known reason to leave abruptly or separately. All were college students, with stable lives and no reported conflicts or threats. Their families described them as responsible and cautious. The theory of a random attack or kidnapping seemed unlikely in this isolated setting. One critical detail emerged. The men had traveled a considerable distance from the basketball game location, taking an unfamiliar and dangerous route into mountainous terrain. This led to questions about why they chose that path at all. Was it a shortcut, a wrong turn, or were they fleeing something unknown? Speculation arose that the men might have become lost after taking a wrong turn or trying to find a shortcut home. However, the choice to abandon the car and venture on foot into the wilderness under harsh winter conditions remained puzzling. None of them were known for outdoor survival skills, and the area was notoriously unforgiving. In the days following the discovery of the car, searchers found evidence of a campfire several miles from where the vehicle had been located. This suggested the men had survived for some time after leaving the car. Yet, the reasons for their extended stay in such a remote area, without proper gear or shelter, were unclear. The fact that the car was found with the engine running and radio playing suggested a sudden or urgent departure. Some investigators hypothesized that the men might have been disoriented or panicked, perhaps due to an accident, illness, or exposure to environmental factors such as carbon monoxide poisoning. But no concrete proof supported these theories. Throughout the early investigation, the mystery deepened. Why would 5 healthy young men, in the prime of their lives, wander into the freezing mountains with no clear plan? Why abandon a running vehicle? Why did none attempt to seek help or return to safety? The disappearance of the Yuba County Five was complicated by the terrain and weather conditions. The Sierra Nevada foothills were covered in snow and ice, with freezing temperatures common in February. Exposure to such harsh elements without adequate clothing or supplies would have been life-threatening. The chances of survival were slim. No signs of foul play were ever discovered. No footprints or tracks indicating struggle. No evidence of wildlife attacks. The men had seemingly vanished due to a combination of misfortune and possibly poor decision-making. This first chapter of the Yuba County Five case sets a haunting tone of confusion and tragedy. It begins with a simple night out, transforms into a desperate and unexplained departure into the wilderness, and ends with an abandoned car that holds more questions than answers. The initial mystery is not just about disappearance, but about the puzzling choices made by the men, the unforgiving environment that awaited them, and the chilling silence that followed their sudden vanishing. What happened after they left the car? Why did they not return? The answers remained hidden in the cold, dark wilderness, waiting to be uncovered in the next chapters of this disturbing and unresolved story. Months after the disappearance of the 5 young men from Yuba County, the grim search for answers took a tragic turn with the discovery of their bodies scattered across the remote wilderness. The findings only deepened the mystery surrounding their fate and introduced a chilling layer of confusion and sorrow. The first body was found several months after the disappearance, in a remote ranger's cabin roughly 8 miles from the site where their car was abandoned. This cabin was known to be used seasonally by forest rangers and hunters, but was unoccupied at the time. The body inside was identified as that of Ted Weiher. What made this discovery perplexing was not only that he had died from starvation, but that there was food available in the cabin, a quantity sufficient to sustain life. Ted was found lying on a cot, dressed in his normal clothes, without any apparent injuries or signs of violence. The state of the body suggested he had survived for some time but was unable or unwilling to leave the cabin. This raised questions about what might have caused him to succumb despite the resources around him. The remaining 4 bodies were found months later, spread out in different areas within several miles of the cabin. Each body was found under baffling circumstances. For instance, one was located several miles away in dense forest, with no signs that he had attempted to seek shelter or signal for help. Another was found near a river, appearing to have collapsed there, again with no indication of injuries. The 4th body was located on a hillside, clothed inadequately for the harsh winter conditions, suggesting extreme disorientation or confusion. The state of decomposition of some bodies made exact time and cause of death difficult to establish. However, investigators concluded that exposure to the freezing cold was a contributing factor in most cases, with hypothermia likely playing a critical role. The absence of trauma or foul play in any of the bodies added to the enigmatic nature of the case. A puzzling detail was the positioning of the bodies. Some were found in places that seemed illogical for anyone trying to survive or find help. In particular, the discovery of one of the men sitting upright on a stump with his hands folded in his lap suggested a calm or resigned state at the moment of death, which contrasted starkly with the harsh, chaotic circumstances. Forensic analysis found no indications of violence, trauma, or struggle on the remains. There were no signs of animal predation or scavenging either, suggesting that the bodies had been undisturbed for some time. The lack of injuries supported the idea that the men did not fall victim to foul play or accidents, but rather died from natural causes exacerbated by the environment. Another strange aspect was the absence of personal effects on some of the bodies. Items such as wallets, watches, and keys were missing, leading to speculation about whether these had been lost during their movements or removed by unknown circumstances. Some of the clothes were also disheveled or missing, a fact that puzzled searchers considering the freezing weather. The discovery of the bodies brought to light the devastating power of nature when combined with human vulnerability. The men, likely suffering from exhaustion, cold, and perhaps mental confusion, had succumbed one by one in different locations, unable to come together or find shelter. The harsh environment and the long time gap between disappearance and recovery made it impossible to reconstruct exactly how events unfolded. The condition of the bodies also suggested that some of the men had survived for an extended period after abandoning the car. The presence of the cabin, stocked with food, added a tragic layer to the story, one where survival was possible, yet somehow unattained. It raised the question of why they did not stay in the cabin, why some left shelter, and why they did not signal for help. In the aftermath of the discovery, investigators began exploring theories that could explain the men's bizarre behavior and deaths. One prominent idea was that the men had suffered from hypothermia, which can cause paradoxical behaviors such as removing clothing, confusion, and irrational movements. This condition could explain why they wandered away from safety, failed to take advantage of available resources, and ultimately perished in the wilderness. The theory of hypothermia was supported by reports from experts on cold exposure, who explained that the condition affects the brain's decision-making ability, leading to poor judgment and erratic actions. Such cognitive impairment could have turned the group's efforts to survive into a series of fatal missteps. The lack of any signs of violence, struggle, or foul play supported the idea that the deaths were accidental, the tragic result of environmental exposure rather than criminal activity. Yet, this explanation left many questions unanswered, especially why 5 intelligent, capable young men would become so disoriented and separated. The findings also perplexed the families and friends of the men, who struggled to reconcile the image of their loved ones with the circumstances of their deaths. The mystery of why they left the car, why they did not stay together, and why they failed to use available resources added an unbearable weight to their grief. Months and years after the discovery, the Yuba County 5 case remains a haunting enigma. The combination of starvation, hypothermia, and disorientation paints a tragic picture of human frailty, but the unanswered questions continue to fuel speculation and theories. The mystery deepened as experts, investigators, and amateur sleuths alike have attempted to piece together the puzzle, searching for clues in the frozen wilderness. The story of the Yuba County 5 serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly circumstances can turn deadly in harsh environments, even for the young and healthy. It also highlights how the human mind and body can fail under extreme stress, leading to behavior that defies common sense. Ultimately, the discovery of the bodies was a chilling confirmation of the men's fate, a slow, lonely demise in the wilderness that defied explanation. Their deaths left a lingering question of why survival was so elusive and why 5 lives were lost in such a haunting and inexplicable way. The Yuba County 5 case remains one of the most baffling and disturbing mysteries in American true crime history, largely because of the strange and contradictory evidence surrounding the men's final days. The perplexing circumstances defy straightforward explanations and have fueled numerous theories, each attempting to unravel why 5 healthy, intelligent young men became lost in the wilderness, ultimately succumbing to a fate that remains unclear. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case is the apparent irrationality displayed by the men in the face of survival. When the men's car was found abandoned in a remote mountain area with the engine still running, many would expect that the group had intended to return or signal for help. Yet, instead of staying together near the vehicle or seeking shelter nearby, the men scattered, traveling in different directions, some seemingly wandering without clear purpose. This fragmented dispersal flies in the face of basic survival instincts. Typically, stranded individuals seek to conserve energy, stay together, and utilize nearby resources. The men's behavior instead suggested confusion and disorientation. Medical experts have pointed to a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, a symptom of severe hypothermia where individuals remove clothing despite freezing temperatures. This counterintuitive behavior is thought to be caused by impaired blood circulation and brain dysfunction during extreme cold exposure, leading victims to feel overheated and vulnerable. Several of the men were found inadequately clothed for the harsh winter environment, supporting this theory. One man was discovered without shoes, another missing a jacket, and others with clothing in disarray. This suggested that hypothermia-induced confusion may have caused them to shed clothes in a desperate but fatal attempt to alleviate internal discomfort. Paradoxical undressing can also cause individuals to wander off into dangerous areas, away from shelter or help, which might explain why the bodies were found scattered. The condition of the men's remains and their locations also sparked speculation about a possible psychological breakdown or mass panic. Some theories suggest that the group, overwhelmed by the harsh wilderness and isolation, experienced severe mental stress or trauma. Such states can impair decision-making and promote irrational behavior, including separation from the group. In survival scenarios, group cohesion is often vital, but here, the men's dispersal likely reduced their chances of rescue or mutual support. Further complicating the mystery is the presence of the ranger's cabin, which was stocked with food and supplies. Ted Wyher's body was found inside, lying near the food, yet he died of starvation. This haunting detail has sparked endless debate. Why did Ted, apparently aware of the food nearby, not consume enough to survive? Was he physically unable due to injury or illness, or was he mentally incapacitated? The fact that the others left the cabin to face the freezing wilderness suggests a disconnection or desperation beyond simple survival instincts. Medical experts have also considered the possibility of a neurological event such as a stroke, seizure, or intoxication affecting the group. However, toxicology reports and autopsies failed to reveal substances or injuries that could conclusively explain their behavior. No evidence of alcohol or drug overdose was found, and there were no physical signs of trauma or attack. Some theories venture into more speculative territory, considering the impact of rare atmospheric or environmental phenomena. The area where the men vanished is mountainous and prone to extreme weather changes. Some researchers have hypothesized that sudden, severe weather, like whiteout snowstorms or unexpected drops in temperature, may have disoriented the men and prevented effective navigation. However, weather records from that period showed no extreme events on the exact days of disappearance. Another suggestion involves the possibility of an animal attack causing panic and scattering. But no injuries consistent with animal predation were found, and the men's clothing and belongings remained largely undisturbed. The lack of physical trauma makes this theory unlikely. Psychological explanations delve into group dynamics and interpersonal relationships. Although the 5 men were acquaintances, it is unknown how strong their bonds were under stress. Some experts have proposed that conflict or fear might have caused fragmentation. Yet, no evidence of disputes or violence emerged from the investigation. The Yuba County 5 case also prompted theories about secretive or covert government involvement, particularly given the proximity of the area to sensitive military installations and testing grounds. Some speculate that the men may have stumbled upon restricted areas or witnessed classified activities, prompting their disappearance or deaths. These claims remain unsubstantiated and fall into the realm of conspiracy theories. One of the most haunting elements of the case is the silence and lack of closure for the families and community. Unlike many disappearances where foul play or accidents provide some answers, the Yuba County 5 story ends with confusion and unanswered questions. The men simply vanished, only to be found months later in conditions that defy simple explanation. The psychological toll on the families was immense. Not only did they suffer the loss of their loved ones, but they were left to grapple with the haunting ambiguity surrounding their final days. Without concrete answers, grief mingled with frustration and suspicion, leaving wounds that have never fully healed. In the years since the tragedy, the case has attracted significant attention from amateur sleuths, historians, and documentary filmmakers, all attempting to piece together the puzzle. Some new evidence and leads have emerged sporadically, but none have resolved the core mystery. Advances in forensic technology offered a glimmer of hope, with DNA testing and cold case analysis revisited multiple times. Despite these efforts, no new suspects or definitive explanations have emerged. The mystery endures, a chilling reminder of how nature and circumstance can overwhelm even the strongest individuals. Ultimately, the Yuba County 5 case represents a tragic convergence of human vulnerability, harsh environment, and inexplicable circumstance. The men's deaths were not violent or criminal, but the result of conditions and decisions that remain elusive. Their story challenges assumptions about survival and underscores the fragile line between life and death in the wilderness. For those who study or reflect on this case, the haunting question remains: what drove 5 young men to abandon their vehicle, separate, and wander into the cold, never to return? The answer may lie forever lost in the forests of Northern California, as silent and inscrutable as the mountain air itself. The final chapter of the Yuba County 5 mystery delves into the aftermath, the enduring questions, and the haunting legacy left by this chilling case. Despite exhaustive investigations and public intrigue spanning decades, the true sequence of events that led to the deaths of these 5 young men remains shrouded in uncertainty. The evidence recovered from the scene and the scattered bodies raised more questions than answers, fueling speculation that touches on human psychology, environmental hazards, and the fragile boundary between reason and desperation. After the bodies were discovered over the course of several months, investigators meticulously pieced together the timeline and circumstances. The remains were found in extremely remote, difficult terrain, scattered miles apart, which complicated the task of understanding what happened after the initial disappearance. The locations where the men died indicated that some succumbed relatively close to their abandoned car, while others had wandered deeper into the wilderness. The harsh winter conditions played a significant role, as sub-zero temperatures and deep snow reduced the likelihood of survival and made any search efforts perilous. The men's physical condition and the position of their bodies strongly supported hypothermia as the primary cause of death. Several autopsies revealed signs consistent with prolonged exposure to cold, such as frostbite and internal organ damage due to freezing temperatures. However, the puzzling behaviors prior to death, including the abandonment of shelter and their scattered locations, continued to confound experts. Hypothermia often impairs cognitive function, leading to confusion, irrational decisions, and paradoxical actions like removing clothing despite the cold, which may explain some of their inexplicable behavior. Yet, certain anomalies stood out. Ted Weiher's death by starvation in the cabin stocked with food remains one of the most haunting aspects. Medical experts speculated that he may have suffered from severe disorientation or physical incapacitation, which prevented him from using the available supplies. Others suggested possible psychological collapse or even some form of metabolic or neurological condition that impaired his ability to eat. The fact that he died alone, near food, while his companions perished outside, highlights the tragic nature of the ordeal. The investigation also considered the possibility that the men's decision to leave their car was precipitated by fear, injury, or the onset of panic. One theory proposed that they heard or perceived a threat nearby, whether from wildlife, environmental hazards, or something else entirely, that compelled them to flee into the wilderness separately rather than staying put or seeking help together. This dispersal reduced their chances of mutual aid and survival dramatically. Over the years, the case has drawn intense interest from forensic psychologists, survival experts, and true crime enthusiasts, each offering interpretations that vary from the plausible to the speculative. Some experts emphasize the impact of isolation and sensory deprivation, suggesting that the men's mental state deteriorated under the stress of their situation. Prolonged exposure to cold combined with exhaustion and hunger can cause hallucinations, memory loss, and impaired judgment, which might explain the erratic choices made in their final hours. Another angle explores the role of group dynamics and social psychology. Stressful and life-threatening situations often amplify interpersonal tensions and fractures within groups, but in this case, there is little evidence of conflict. Instead, the disbanding of the group might have been a symptom of collective panic or breakdown rather than interpersonal disputes. When people face overwhelming threats, they sometimes respond with flight or dissociation, behaviors that can seem irrational from the outside but are driven by deep psychological processes. The mystery has also inspired more fringe theories and cultural speculation. Some propose that the men fell victim to supernatural forces or paranormal phenomena linked to the remote wilderness. While these claims lack empirical support, they speak to the human need to find meaning or patterns in senseless tragedy. Others have speculated about secret government experiments or covert activities, citing the remote location's proximity to military installations. These theories remain unproven and widely discredited by experts. What remains undeniably tragic is the human cost. 5 young lives, full of potential and promise, were lost in a manner that offers no clear closure. The families were left with unanswered questions and the cruel ambiguity of a fate that cannot be fully explained. Their grief was compounded by the media attention and public fascination, which sometimes blurred the lines between respectful remembrance and sensationalism. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the unforgiving power of nature and the limitations of human endurance. It highlights how even in modern times, with advances in technology and rescue operations, wilderness environments can overwhelm individuals who are unprepared or unlucky. The Yuba County 5 story underscores the importance of preparation, communication, and group cohesion in survival scenarios. Efforts to memorialize the men have taken various forms, from local tributes to documentaries and books that attempt to honor their memory and bring awareness to the case. The enduring mystery has cemented the Yuba County 5 as a haunting chapter in American true crime lore, a story that captivates due to its tragic complexity and unresolved nature. Despite the passage of time, new information occasionally surfaces, but none has drastically altered the understanding of the case. DNA re-examinations, forensic advancements, and fresh interviews have helped clarify minor details but failed to solve the core enigma. The men's disappearances and deaths remain a somber reminder of how nature and circumstance can intertwine to produce outcomes beyond comprehension. Ultimately, the Yuba County 5 case challenges the human desire for definitive answers. It reveals the uncomfortable reality that some tragedies resist explanation and defy closure. Their story lingers in the collective consciousness as a chilling example of mystery, loss, and the fragile line between life and death in the wilderness. The men's last journey into the unknown continues to provoke reflection on survival, human psychology, and the profound silence that sometimes follows disappearance. End of Story 4. Story 5. The Oakland County Child Killer, 1976 to 1977, Michigan. Between 1976 and 1977, in the peaceful suburbs of Michigan, children began to vanish. Not in the dark of night, but in daylight, just blocks from their homes. For were found days later, washed, dressed, and gently posed in the snow, as if their killer cared deeply about their appearance. But beneath this haunting tenderness lay a level of depravity that terrified an entire generation. The killer was never caught. Whispers of a pedophile ring, a powerful cover-up, and a suspect who died under suspicious circumstances continue to fuel the mystery. This isn't just a story of lost innocence. It's a story that makes even the safest places feel unsafe. Sleep, if you dare. In the mid-1970s, the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Oakland County, Michigan, were considered some of the safest places to raise a family. Nestled just outside of Detroit, these communities had the kind of peaceful atmosphere that parents trusted and children roamed freely within. But in 1976, something began to stir beneath that surface of normalcy. Something dark, calculated, and patient. Over the course of 13 months, a mysterious figure or group would forever change the way these towns viewed safety. It began with the sudden disappearance of a young boy, only 12 years old, who never came home after heading to the store. His parents reported him missing immediately, and a frantic search ensued. Days later, he was found, peacefully laid out in plain sight, as though someone had taken great care in positioning him. The community was shaken, but still hopeful it was a one-time tragedy. But the pattern would repeat itself. Another child vanished. Then another. And then another. Each victim was a young child, between the ages of 10 and 12, taken without a trace. No witnesses. No struggle. No known motive. The most disturbing common thread wasn't just the abductions, but what happened afterward. The children were missing for days, sometimes over a week. And when they were found, it became clear that someone had cared for them in some twisted way, ensuring they were clean, groomed, and carefully placed in a public location, as if delivering a message no one could fully decipher. The media quickly coined a chilling title, The Oakland County Child Killer. It was more than a headline. It became a legend of dread whispered across playgrounds and over dinner tables. Parents became paranoid, enforcing curfews, refusing to let children walk to school or ride their bikes. The idea that someone was hunting children, keeping them close for days, then calmly leaving them behind, was more than a community could bear. People began to wonder if this was truly the work of one individual, or something far more organized. Law enforcement launched one of the largest investigations in Michigan's history. Over 20,000 tips were reportedly collected. Detectives from multiple departments worked tirelessly, combing through leads, interviewing known offenders, and tracking any vehicle sightings. But no arrest was ever made. The killers seemed to vanish, as if their purpose had been fulfilled, or as if they had simply lost interest. Years passed, and theories grew. Some believed it was the work of a lone predator, someone intelligent enough to stay invisible and blend into the crowd. Others suspected a ring of individuals, possibly linked by shared obsessions or power. There were whispers about a wealthy businessman with dark secrets, a man who died under suspicious circumstances before charges could be brought against him. Still others believed the entire case was part of a cover-up, one that protected people with influence. As time moved on, the case became a ghost story woven into the identity of Oakland County. Even now, it's not uncommon to hear older residents recall the fear that swept through those neighborhoods. Children who grew up during that time remember looking over their shoulders on walks to school or sleeping with lights on at night. Some have never fully outgrown that fear. What makes this case linger in the minds of so many is not just the tragedy, but the precision. This wasn't chaos or impulse. It was controlled, cold, and methodical. Whoever was behind it knew how to remain in the shadows. They knew how to avoid leaving evidence. And they knew how to vanish. Even decades later, advancements in forensic technology have brought new hope to cold cases around the world. DNA testing, digital databases, and criminal profiling have solved cases once thought unsolvable. But in this case, the silence remains. The files still sit in boxes, collecting dust, each page filled with leads that went nowhere and names that were never called again. For the families of the children, time has done little to ease the ache. Some still wait for answers. Others have stopped hoping. And the towns themselves, though outwardly modern and thriving, still carry the weight of a wound that never quite closed. The Oakland County child killer may never be found. But the legacy left behind, of fear, unanswered questions, and lives cut far too short, remains an open chapter in one of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. As investigators studied the unsettling pattern left behind in Oakland County, a strange consistency began to take shape, details that hinted at something far more calculated than a typical crime of opportunity. Each child had vanished under similar circumstances, broad daylight, in familiar areas, while doing something ordinary. Running errands, walking home, visiting a friend. There were no break-ins, no visible signs of confrontation. It was as if someone had quietly stepped into their routines and plucked them from existence without a sound. The locations where the children were taken, scattered across different towns within Oakland County, seemed random at first. But a deeper look suggested a deliberate web. Someone was watching. Someone was learning patterns and exploiting trust. Each abduction site was near roads with quick exits. Each discovery location was carefully chosen, as if the person responsible wanted the children to be found, but not the truth. The fact that the children had been missing for several days, and then later discovered in places they couldn't have reached on their own, left investigators puzzled. These weren't spontaneous crimes. They were carefully executed over time. Whoever was behind them seemed to have the resources and the patience to wait, to plan, and to act without leaving behind clear evidence. Authorities launched a task force and brought in experts from across the country. Psychologists were consulted to develop behavioral profiles. Criminologists reviewed every detail of the case files. Roadblocks were set up, suspects interviewed, and witness sketches compiled. But despite the sheer effort, the identity of the person, or people, responsible remained a mystery. The more law enforcement dug, the more questions surfaced. One of the most disturbing details involved the condition in which the children were found. While investigators avoided sharing too many specifics, they confirmed that the children appeared to have been cared for during the time they were missing. Their clothes were clean. Their hair was combed. It was as if someone had been trying to maintain the appearance of order while carrying out something unthinkable. This eerie contradiction haunted everyone involved. Rumors soon began to swirl. Some residents feared it was someone within the community, someone who knew the families, the routines, even the investigations. Others believed the case pointed to something bigger, possibly an organized group with a shared purpose. A handful of leads hinted at connections to individuals with questionable backgrounds and powerful friends. One such lead revolved around a man of considerable wealth and influence. He had ties to individuals under scrutiny for unrelated offenses. Though never officially charged, his name kept resurfacing. When he died unexpectedly, some wondered if secrets died with him. In the years following, numerous suspects were questioned and multiple theories proposed, but no definitive proof ever surfaced. And as time passed, the trail grew colder. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. Files were boxed and stored away. The energy that once burned through the investigation was slowly replaced with quiet frustration and resignation. To this day, there is still no single suspect that investigators can confidently name as the Oakland County child killer. Some believe the person responsible was a drifter who slipped away unnoticed. Others think the true answer lies within the case files, buried beneath redacted pages, overlooked tips, or leads that were never followed due to lack of resources or mounting pressure. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the case never received closure. No trial. No confessions. No justice. Just 4 children, lost in the silence, and a legacy of unease that continues to linger like a fog over the community. Oakland County has changed since the 1970s. New homes. New schools. A different generation of children playing in yards and riding bikes down freshly paved streets. But for those who lived through that era, the ones who remember the missing posters, the sudden silences in the classrooms, the locked doors and drawn curtains, those memories never left. They exist just beneath the surface, resurfacing when the name is mentioned, when anniversaries pass, or when another cold case is brought to light. The Oakland County child killer case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, not just because of what was done, but because of how carefully it was hidden. Somewhere out there may still be someone who knows the truth. Someone who was close enough to see but never came forward. Or perhaps the truth is far more elusive, buried in a past that refuses to give up its secrets. Years rolled on, and the weight of the unanswered questions only deepened. Oakland County, once a place of suburban calm, bore a mark it couldn't wash away. What started as a horrific pattern turned into a labyrinth of dead ends. The more authorities searched, the more it felt like someone had covered their tracks with precision, or that something vital had been overlooked from the very beginning. The community's fear had settled into a kind of uneasy quiet. People still remembered the names. Parents from that era remembered locking their doors during the day and checking the streets before letting their children play outside. Every unfamiliar car was noticed. Every unfamiliar face was scrutinized. But the answers never came. Decades later, new technology gave investigators a brief sense of hope. DNA profiling had evolved, allowing previously collected samples to be retested. There were whispers that one of the preserved pieces of evidence might finally reveal the truth. But even with these advances, nothing conclusive emerged. DNA was found, but it didn't match anyone in the national databases. Some believed it had degraded over time. Others feared it was never from the perpetrator at all, just another ghost in a case full of shadows. Then there were the odd letters. A few emerged over the years, sent to local news stations or the families involved. Some claimed knowledge of the crimes. Others offered apologies or cryptic clues. Investigators chased down these leads with urgency, but each time they arrived at the same place. Another hoax, another false promise, another cruel reminder of how easily people exploit pain. Among the theories that developed, one stood out for its chilling implications. It wasn't about a lone individual working in secret, but about a network, a small group of people who shared disturbing interests and protected one another. Some theorists pointed to potential links between known offenders in the region, suggesting that the truth might be too complex for a simple arrest to ever resolve. A few names repeatedly appeared in unofficial reports, individuals with checkered pasts, some of whom had legal influence or financial power. Though never officially accused, their associations and odd behavior drew suspicion. But suspicion was not proof. And over time, those names faded into obscurity, either by design or by the passage of time. Despite the years, the pain for the families involved never lessened. For them, each new article, each anniversary, and each passing day was a reminder that justice had never come. They had lived through the initial horror, the false hope, the endless waiting. They had seen promises of breakthroughs fall apart and had heard apologies from officials who could do nothing more than say the case was still open. Investigators eventually formed new task forces and sought assistance from cold case units. New detectives took on the files, hoping a fresh perspective might unlock something overlooked. But the volume of information, stacks of paper, hours of interviews, decades of scattered tips, was overwhelming. Many who tried to piece it together found themselves lost in the very maze they sought to solve. What remained was a case that lingered not just because of its horror, but because of its silence. In a world where so many crimes find answers through persistence or science, the Oakland County case stands as a chilling reminder that some stories resist resolution. Some wrongs go unpunished. Some mysteries persist, not because they are unsolvable, but because the truth hides behind layers of fear, silence, and forgotten detail. And so, the story continued to be told, not in headlines or courtroom verdicts, but in whispers, late at night, among those who remember. Among those who still believe someone out there knows more than they've ever said. Among those who look at the past and wonder how such careful evil could have walked so quietly through familiar streets, leaving behind a trail that no one has ever been able to follow to its end. Years became decades, but the echoes of those unsolved crimes never faded. In Oakland County, people still remembered. The streets had changed. New families moved in. Neighborhoods were rebuilt, and playgrounds grew quiet again. But beneath the surface of everyday life, something darker remained, a silent question hanging in the cold Michigan air. The case remained open. Not closed, not solved, just suspended in time. Investigators would occasionally revisit the files, hoping that a fresh look or a piece of new evidence might break the silence. They pored over interview transcripts and old photographs, reanalyzing timelines and behavior. Nothing was too small to consider, yet nothing ever brought them closer. The strangest part was how methodical it all seemed. Whoever was responsible had not acted in a rush or panic. The actions were deliberate, the scenes oddly calm. That eerie sense of control became one of the most haunting aspects. These weren't crimes of impulse. They felt staged, managed, planned to the smallest detail. It was as if someone had rehearsed it all before carrying it out. That led to theories both simple and elaborate. Some imagined a lone person, quietly hiding in plain sight, always one step ahead. Others believed in a more intricate truth, perhaps a conspiracy, a group, or someone protected by connections that made them untouchable. Each possibility was frightening in its own way, and each one led to nowhere. In the years that followed, families of the victims became voices for justice. They didn't want revenge. They wanted resolution. They wanted to understand why it happened, who was behind it, and how it was allowed to go unsolved for so long. But with every press conference and every news update that came and went, they were reminded of how little had changed. Grief turned into endurance. Hope into resilience. As new technology developed, Many believed DNA analysis might finally crack the case. Partial profiles had been lifted, and for a moment, it seemed like science might accomplish what decades of effort had not. But again, the results remained inconclusive. The profiles didn't match anyone in the national database. The evidence refused to speak clearly. The region eventually grew used to the mystery. It became a part of the local identity, something people whispered about but rarely discussed openly. The case found its way into documentaries, books, and internet forums. Online sleuths offered theories and speculations, poring over grainy photos and archived articles. But even with all that effort, no one could explain why the case resisted closure. And yet, in a way, the fear lingered because it never got an ending. The idea that someone could have committed such careful and devastating acts, and then vanished into ordinary life, unsettled even the most rational minds. It suggested that true danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lives quietly, unnoticed, just behind the curtain of what we consider normal. Even today, some residents say they still think about it when the nights grow too quiet, when the wind carries through empty streets, and the snow begins to fall just like it did back then. It's not just the horror of the crimes that lingers, it's the silence afterward. The complete absence of resolution. The idea that someone, somewhere, might still remember the truth and has chosen to keep it buried. The Oakland County case stands among the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history, not just because of what happened, but because of what never did. No trial. No confession. No final page. Just a community that was forever changed by something it could never fully understand. And while time continues to move forward, and the world becomes louder with each passing year, this story remains frozen, like footprints in the snow that never melted. Like questions whispered just before sleep that never find an answer. For some, it's just another unsolved case. But for those who remember, it's a shadow that never left. As the night deepens and shadows grow longer, these stories remind us that some mysteries never rest. The answers remain just out of reach, hidden in silence and darkness, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. Sleep now, but keep your mind open, because sometimes the most unsettling tales aren't the ones from long ago, but the ones still whispered in the wind. Thank you for joining Mr. Dar's Nights tonight. If these stories kept you awake, remember to follow for more true crime mysteries, told softly to haunt your dreams. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.